Hey friends, tonight we're not chasing legends of knights or grand castles, but stepping quietly into the uneasy shadows of medieval life, where ordinary days could unravel into silent dread for reasons we barely remember now. This world built cathedrals, but it also whispered omens into every corner, from the way candles flickered to which side of the bed you rose. So, if strange history is your thing, like the video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this community stretch across the world. Now, dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's slip into tonight's unsettling journey together. Hearing three crows was believed to herald impending death. It begins with a sound. A rough, hoarse caw breaking through the morning mist. Then another, and then more. Three crows. That was all it took. Not a scream, not a whisper of words. Just three brief cries carried over damp fields or narrow lanes, and the rhythm of a medieval day would subtly shift. The pause of a scythe mid-swing. A woman glancing toward the chimney corner where her mother sat the evening before. The tightening of a throat before any prayers were even spoken. You wouldn't hear alarm bells. You'd hear silence, quiet as while soaking up water. Across much of medieval Europe, the crow was not simply a bird. It was a presence, observed and interpreted as carefully as the phases of the moon or the direction of the wind. But when it came to omens, it wasn't the solitary crow perched on a fence post that stirred concern. It was the third cry. Three caws, close together, almost rehearsed. That was the pattern people whispered about, the rhythm they feared. The belief was not written in formal law, nor necessarily recorded in church sermons. But it lived in the folds of daily speech, embedded in sayings, passed on at fireside meals, muttered by elders when the younger ones mocked the idea. Superstition, yes. But also a kind of oral folklore woven into the fabric of life. Crows, of course, were common. They appeared at harvest, where fallen grain and rodents made for easy feeding. They watched battlefields from a distance, waiting to descend. And they lingered near gallows and execution sites, where man's end met nature's cycle. But for the everyday villager, especially one living miles from political centers or religious authorities, the presence of crows was less symbolic and more personal. The association with death was not merely poetic, it was witnessed. Over and over. A crow overhead, a neighbor gone by week's end. Coincidence, perhaps. But repetition breeds belief. Imagine yourself stepping out into the chill of early morning. Your breath is visible. The fire back inside has long since turned to embers. There's bread to bake, a fence to mend. You walk past the granary and hear it. Call it, not drawn out. Not the usual meandering chatter. Your hand freezes on the latch. You glance behind you, not out of fear of the crow, but of what it might signify. In this world, signs matter. It's difficult to fully explain how heavily belief weighed in medieval life. Today, we might dismiss such things as old wives' tales. But in a time when most people could not read, when the only printed words they encountered were perhaps a Latin psalm or a bishop's proclamation, the world was interpreted through signs. Weather, illness, hunger, fertility, all these were understood through patterns of nature and behavior. The crow, being so intelligent, so familiar, yet somehow removed from domestic life, existed in a liminal space. It wasn't a pet. It wasn't hunted. It was an observer, a scavenger, a witness. So when it spoke, when it cried 3 times in rapid succession, people listened. And they didn't just listen. They adjusted. It wasn't uncommon, for example, for a family to light a candle earlier than usual, or offer an extra slice of bread to the poor in quiet appeasement. A farmer might delay travel to a market, unsure whether the sound marked danger for himself or someone he loved. A midwife might check on an expectant mother sooner than planned, just in case. No one ever said aloud, "The crows told me to do this." That would have sounded strange even then. Instead, there was simply a hush in the air. A ripple in the routine. It wasn't always about fear either. Sometimes, it was about preparation. In an age where death came frequently, through fever, childbirth, infection, injury, the idea that nature might offer a small, dark warning felt almost like a gift. It gave people a chance to act, however small their action might be. Say a prayer. Deliver a token to the church. Sit beside an elder relative for 1 extra hour. These weren't grand rituals, but quiet gestures of acknowledgement, of readiness. Scholars who study folklore sometimes refer to this kind of belief as protective fatalism. The notion that while you can't change what's coming, you can behave respectfully in its presence. In this sense, the crow's cry wasn't a sentence, it was a knock on the door. Not loud, not long, but unmistakable. Over time, this belief found its way into proverbs and rural sayings. When the third crow cries, mind the fire and close the gate. 3 calls from the black beak, and wool turns to mourning cloth. It wasn't unusual for children to be warned gently when playing near a flock, told not to imitate their cries too closely. Not because the crow was sacred, but because it was watched by forces that people felt they barely understood. In some regions, there were even subtle rituals to counteract the omen. Tossing salt over the shoulder wasn't just for spilled grains. It might be done after hearing the third crow. Some would draw a circle with their thumb on the hearthstone. Others would softly hum a tune their mother taught them. Not quite a hymn, not quite a lullaby, but meant to settle the air. It's worth noting that not all saw the crow this way. In Celtic traditions, for instance, the crow was often associated with the battlefield goddess Morrigan, both feared and revered, a symbol of fate and strength. In Norse lore, Odin was accompanied by 2 ravens, close cousins to crows, who whispered news from across the world. So, depending on region and era, the meaning of the bird could shift. But among common folk, especially in medieval England, the notion that 3 cries of a crow signaled death was quietly consistent. Even in more modern times, echoes of this belief remain. Literature and poetry have long used crows to signify dread or sorrow. In some rural places, older generations still hesitate at the sound. They may not confess it out loud, but the pause is there. A breath caught. A glance exchanged. A brief wondering, who will it be? And then, as quickly as it came, the moment passes. The crows fly off. The fields resume their murmurs. Bread is needed. Firewood is stacked. Life moves forward. But somewhere in the rhythm of that day, something has changed. Not fate, perhaps, but awareness. Even now, the idea lingers. Not in superstition, maybe, but in the human impulse to look for signs, to listen for patterns, to find meaning in sound, and perhaps, deep down, to believe that even in death, the world offers a warning, a whisper across the sky, shaped like 3 short cries. Leaving shoes upside down invited demons into the home. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn in a small medieval cottage. The fire has long since burned out, the air is damp and still, and the floor is cool beneath your feet. Somewhere beyond the shutters, a rooster calls softly, not to startle, but to announce the familiar rhythm of another day. But before bread is sliced or water fetched, there is one quiet duty that must be performed. You stoop and scan the threshold. Your eyes drift to the pair of worn leather shoes beside the door, placed carefully, upright, toes pointing out. You exhale gently. All is as it should be. For a housewife in the Middle Ages, this simple act of inspection was not superstition in the way we think of it today. It was maintenance, of luck, of safety, of unseen balance. Shoes left overturned, sawls to the sky, were believed to invite the wandering dead, or worse, unclean spirits who sought doorways into the living world. A careless gesture by a child, or a distracted guest, could, it was said, undo all the household's careful protections. Shoes held a peculiar power. They were vessels of motion, carriers of intention. They tread upon soil, filth, and sorrow, then returned to the quiet of the hearth. Many believed they collected more than just mud. To place them carelessly was not just a sign of disorder, but a breach in the barrier between the mundane and the malevolent. This belief stretched far beyond one village or region. In rural England, placing shoes upside down was said to attract the black dog, a spectral omen of death. In Eastern Europe, tales whispered of spirits that followed the soles of shoes into the home, lurking in shadows, drawing illness, or whispering in dreams. Shoes had contact with the ground, the underworld in some symbolic traditions, and turning them face up was akin to inviting what lay beneath to rise. Children, of course, did not always understand the weight of such placement. They might toss off their clogs after play, or nudge a pair under the bench without a thought. And so mothers became quiet watchers. Each morning, before the others stirred, they would straighten the pairs, murmuring a protective phrase or simply touching them as if to reset their meaning. But why shoes? Why did these humble objects become so central to household folklore? Shoes were valuable. For most, a single pair had to last for years. They were repaired, resold, passed down. A cobbler's work was cherished, and because they held shape and memory, shoes were often linked to identity. It wasn't uncommon, in fact, for a deceased person's shoes to be burned or buried. To leave them lying around too long after death was to risk inviting that person's spirit back. In some homes, shoes of the dead were even hidden inside walls, chimneys, or beneath floorboards, a practice that archaeologists still uncover today. These concealed shoes were not misplaced. They were intentionally placed talismans, meant to protect the household by confusing or deterring malevolent spirits. The idea was that the spirit, upon sensing a shoe of the living or the dead, would be misled into thinking the space was already occupied, or would become trapped in a kind of magical loop, circling endlessly around the familiar object and leaving the living alone. This practice extended into architecture. In certain parts of England and Germany, it was believed that putting a shoe in the eaves or foundations could protect the entire structure, a sort of spiritual decoy. Even King Edward IV was rumored to have shoes buried in the walls of his hunting lodge for protection, though no official record confirms this. And while these practices sound strange to modern ears, they echo broader human instincts. We often imbue everyday objects with meaning. The shoes of a loved one can stir emotion long after they've gone. The act of placing them neatly by the door, day after day, becomes ritual. It's a small tether to stability in a world that rarely offered certainty. These beliefs also reflect the medieval sense of boundary between outside and inside, body and spirit, known and unknown. The threshold was not just a plank of wood. It was a line between worlds. What crossed it had to be managed, acknowledged, sometimes appeased. Salt was sprinkled, wreaths were hung, charms were carved into beams. And yes, shoes were turned upright, like small sentries keeping watch. Over time, as literacy spread and church influence grew, many of these practices were dismissed as folk nonsense. But they never fully disappeared. Even into the 19th and early 20th centuries, rural families across Europe and America continued to speak of bad luck tied to shoes on the table or shoes pointing the wrong direction. Some still do today. In a way, these ideas linger because they speak to a human need for agency in the face of the invisible. You may not control illness, famine, or grief, but you can control how your shoes rest at the door. You can straighten them, align them, and in doing so, perhaps realign the day to come. So imagine now a quiet morning centuries ago. The floorboards creak as someone stirs. A kettle is placed near the hearth. Light begins to seep in through slits in the wood. And at the doorway, a pair of shoes stands upright, quietly performing their part in the eternal, unspoken dance between safety and chance. And somewhere not far beyond the village, the wind passes over open fields, carrying with it the memory of many such mornings, when survival depended on small gestures, and superstition was simply another word for care. A mirror falling meant a soul would soon depart the body. Of all the objects in a medieval household, the mirror may have been among the quietest and the most feared. You wouldn't think it to look at one. A simple rectangle of glass or polished metal, hanging by a nail or propped on a shelf. But in those days, when superstition and survival shared equal space in the home, even a sliver of reflection could invite profound unease. Mirrors, you see, were not common. They were costly to produce and difficult to keep. In rural cottages and modest townhomes, most people had never owned one. Those who did, typically families of means or those who inherited one as a rare token, treated it with the same reverence as a sacred heirloom. It wasn't simply that mirrors were fragile or beautiful. It was that they were believed to carry weight, the weight of a soul's image and perhaps its fate. Imagine yourself inside such a home. The fire smolders low in the hearth. A wooden table sits uneven on the stone floor, its surface worn smooth by generations of use. On the far wall, a small looking glass is mounted just above eye level. Maybe it has a brass frame, darkened with age. The surface catches only dim shapes and flickers of candlelight. You might see your face reflected back, but slightly warped, slightly distant. As if the glass didn't return you exactly, but someone like you, hovering just behind. Now imagine that mirror falls. Not from a storm, not from a child's hand, but quietly, suddenly, and without warning. It cracks. And in many households, the reaction would be immediate and chilling. Someone would inhale sharply. Someone else might mutter a prayer beneath their breath. The room would fall still, heavy with recognition. Because in the rhythm of their lives, a mirror breaking was not merely an accident. It was an omen. It meant a soul, perhaps not today, perhaps not even this week, but soon, someone's soul would leave their body. The mirror had caught sight of it and shattered in reply. This belief wasn't isolated to one region or one class. Across medieval Europe, fragments of this fear appear in records and oral traditions. In England, some whispered that mirrors were windows to the other side, and that if they broke without cause, it was because someone, had passed through. In parts of Germany, people would hurriedly cover every mirror in the house if a family member was sick, fearful that the glass might steal the person's soul before death had its rightful turn. In Italy, mirrors were sometimes removed from the home altogether if someone was dying, not out of cleanliness or shame, but caution. There was also the ritual of burial. A cracked mirror was not merely thrown out. It was wrapped in cloth, usually linen or wool, whatever was available, and taken outside. The household might dig a shallow hole beneath a hedge or near a boundary stone. There, the mirror would be placed gently into the earth and covered without ceremony, in hopes of delaying whatever shadow it had stirred. What's striking is how seriously people treated these rituals. This wasn't idle folklore for amusement on cold nights. It was a quiet, constant part of domestic life, just as much as lighting candles or storing grain. People may not have spoken about it openly, especially in towns where the church grew wary of anything that bordered on divination or superstition. But in the hush of their homes, families watched their mirrors. And when they moved house or passed one down to the next generation, they did so carefully, mindful of the object's strange, invisible power. Of course, one might wonder, why mirrors? Why did these simple tools for reflection carry such dread? The answer, it seems, lies in the nature of reflection itself. To see oneself outside the body, clearly, silently, and in reverse, has always been unsettling. In a world without photographs or glass panes, a mirror was often the only time a person would truly see their own face. And that glimpse, rare and often incomplete, held mystery. Was it merely sight? Or was something deeper being shown back? In religious thought, too, mirrors took on symbolic weight. The Apostle Paul once wrote that, "We see now through a glass, darkly," and medieval scholars seized on this to discuss the soul, perception, and the limits of earthly knowledge. A cracked mirror was seen not only as a physical break, but a rupture in understanding, a sign that something hidden had been glimpsed and could not be unseen. In castles and manor houses, mirrors became more ornate and slightly more common, especially by the later Middle Ages. But even among the nobility, caution remained. Some noblewomen reportedly refused to look into a mirror after sundown. Others covered mirrors during childbirth or mourning, believing the veil protected both the living and the spirits that might linger nearby. Art, too, quietly preserved this anxiety. In certain late medieval paintings, mirrors appear in the background, not as symbols of vanity, but of transience. A cracked mirror near a figure suggests change is coming. In some cases, even death. Over time, as mirrors became more affordable and superstition faded into folklore, the fear softened. But traces of it still remain in common phrases and customs. Breaking a mirror is still said to bring 7 years of bad luck, a curious remnant of a much older, deeper fear. Some still instinctively pick up the pieces with care, or wrap them before throwing them away. And in some places, mirrors are still covered in houses of mourning, out of respect, or something more. Today, you might walk past a mirror without thought. You see your reflection clearly, again and again. But in a world that moved slower, where life was more fragile and death more frequent, a mirror falling in silence was not just an object breaking. It was the stillest of alarms. A warning left behind in shards and silence. A quiet sign that one soul might soon take its final reflection and not return. Passing a procession without removing your cap brought misfortune. Imagine yourself on a narrow, cobbled street, just before dawn, in a quiet medieval town where roofs lean low and smoke curls silently from chimneys. The baker's fire has only just begun to crackle. A thin mist lies in the gutters. And then, in the stillness, the slow, deliberate sound of hooves, muffled under heavy drapery, echoes up the lane. A funeral procession is approaching. In many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, death did not simply happen, it passed through. The procession, slow and mournful, was more than just the transport of a body to burial. It was a public ceremony that reminded the living of their own fragile hold on life. People didn't merely watch it pass, they participated in their own quiet way. As the coffin came into view, perhaps on a wheeled bier, perhaps on the shoulders of local men, neighbors would step outside their doors or lean out of windows. Children were taught from a very early age. When the dead pass, you stop what you are doing and you uncover your head. You remove your cap, your hood, your straw hat, whatever you wore, even if the wind bit through your hair. And you stand still. To neglect this small gesture was not merely seen as rude, it was dangerous. Superstitious belief held that spirits of the recently deceased might linger close to the body, watching the living one last time. If someone failed to show proper respect, it was feared that this could draw the attention, or even the ire, of the wandering soul. Worse still, it was believed the misfortune wouldn't be limited to the disrespectful person alone. Entire households or streets might suffer. A failed harvest. A child's sudden illness. Milk souring in the pail before noon. Misfortune, vague and various, might soon follow. The act of bearing the head served several purposes. Practically, it was a show of humility. Culturally, it was a signal of awareness and social cohesion. But spiritually, it was an act of warding, a quiet contract between the living and the dead. To uncover the head was to say, I recognize your passing, and I will not interfere with your crossing. To keep it on was a challenge, intentional or not. This belief in head covering as a spiritual barrier extended beyond funerals. In some parts of Europe, entering a church without removing one's hat was considered deeply disrespectful for similar reasons. It was a place where heaven and earth touched. At a funeral, that veil between worlds was thinner still. For the poorer classes, caps were not merely fashion. They were necessities, barriers against cold, symbols of trade, even identifiers within town life. Yet even in freezing wind or pelting rain, when the dead passed, men and boys would stand motionless, heads bare. In some towns, it became such a practiced ritual that even the dogs quieted and stood still, having absorbed the rhythm of their masters' lives. In towns where processions passed frequently, during plague years or seasons of poor crops, the residents became nearly ceremonial in their observance. Certain crossroads were known as common routes for funeral cortèges. On such corners, old women sat in silence with prayer beads, murmuring litanies not only for the departed but for the living who might unknowingly attract their gaze. In larger cities, the custom evolved. In some boroughs of London or Paris, young boys were hired to walk ahead of the coffin, ringing small bells to alert others of the procession. This was not just a warning to clear the street, it gave people time to prepare themselves, to cross themselves, to whisper a prayer, to stop work and face the street, and of course, to uncover the head. Failing to do so could spark gossip. A neighbor might lean in and whisper, "Did you see old Thomas? Cap still on." And if Thomas's cow miscarried a week later, or if he slipped on the stairs, it wouldn't go unnoticed. In tightly knit towns, misfortune was rarely seen as random. The wrong gesture at the wrong moment, like keeping your head covered, might be seen as an invitation to trouble. Of course, not every town agreed on what counted as proper respect. In some places, only men were expected to uncover their heads. In others, everyone did, including children. In especially devout regions, the passing of a funeral procession might stop daily life altogether. Markets paused. Hammers ceased to strike anvils. Some merchants even shut their stalls briefly, just until the sound of hooves and hymn faded around the corner. And for all this solemnity, processions were not uniform. A rich merchant's burial might include dozens of mourners dressed in black, a hired choir, flowers arranged in tight, somber clusters. But the ritual remained essentially the same even for the humblest villager. The slow movement through town, the turning heads, the silent gestures, the cold breeze on a bare scalp. A town momentarily joined in respectful stillness. Children were not exempt. They were often the most diligent, having been raised in a world where tradition held moral weight. If a boy forgot to remove his cap, it wasn't just a minor scolding. His grandmother might weep softly, convinced a shadow had been invited into the house. The child might sleep with rosemary tucked under his pillow for a week. Superstition, however irrational by today's lens, was deeply practical to them. It helped frame uncertainty and gave some sense of control in a world with very little of it. It's tempting to think of these customs as mere folklore, but they reflect deeper truths about how pre-modern people understood death and community. Death wasn't a private affair. It was woven into the daily rhythms of life. Its signs were everywhere: the tolling of bells, the black cloth, the careful gestures at the threshold. And so a single act, removing your cap, became more than a sign of respect. It became part of a larger choreography of mourning, reverence, and caution. Even today, in certain rural areas or traditional parishes, you might find echoes of this practice. A cap lowered, a head bowed, an instinctive pause as a hearse passes by. The fear of misfortune has faded, but the ritual memory lingers. It is as if some part of us still remembers that moment on the street, the slow sound of hooves, the chill in the air, and the unspoken agreement. For the dead, we make space. And then life, as always, resumes. Sweeping after sunset was said to sweep away one's prosperity. Imagine yourself walking down the narrow path of a medieval village just after sunset. The oil lamps haven't been lit yet, and the last glow of daylight is gently fading behind the rooftops. The air is still, carrying the soft scent of wood smoke and the quiet hush of a town settling into its night. And if you happen to glance at the thresholds of the low, timber-framed cottages, you'd notice something curious. No one, absolutely no one, is sweeping. Even if the wind had kicked straw against the doorway, or if children had tracked in dust from the fields, the brooms sat untouched. Not because of laziness, but because to sweep after sunset was to invite something far worse than a messy floor. It was believed, by mothers, grandmothers, housemaids, even traveling traders, that to sweep the doorstep after dark was to sweep away a family's good fortune. The act itself, so simple by modern standards, was thought to carry dangerous symbolic weight. As the broom scraped the ground, it wasn't just dust and dirt being moved, it was coin, food, and health, cast out into the street where no charm or prayer could recover it. This wasn't a belief confined to one town or century. In fact, variations of it echoed across cultures for hundreds of years. In rural England, the superstition was especially persistent well into the 19th century. Housewives were warned never to clean the hearth or sweep the floor once the sun dipped below the horizon. If a guest spilled crumbs or mud during an evening visit, it was to be left where it fell until the safety of daylight returned. Why did this idea take such a firm root in daily life? It helps to understand what sweeping represented in a time when cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene. It was about ritual, order, and invisible boundaries. The household, especially in poorer communities, was a fragile ecosystem. Food stores were limited, livestock were few, coin was hard-earned, and the threshold of the home was sacred. It marked the space between safety and the outside world. Sweeping symbolized control, but doing it at night, when the world shifted into shadow, when unseen things were believed to stir, meant losing that control. And so, if a woman took up a broom after dusk, especially without necessity, it was said she was casting away the family's luck. She wasn't just removing grime, she was disturbing unseen balances. Neighbors might notice. A passing elder might pause and silently shake their head. A child might be scolded not just for the mess, but for tempting ruin. There was a particular discomfort in seeing that rhythmic back-and-forth motion under moonlight. It felt wrong, like inviting hunger to cross the threshold. For the peasantry, prosperity didn't mean comfort, it meant survival. A single illness in the household, a single bad harvest, a single burst of unexpected expenses could spell devastation. And when you can't control the weather, the soil, or the Lord's taxes, you begin looking for patterns, for rules that give you some power. Don't whistle indoors, or you'll summon spirits. Don't leave a rocking chair moving when no one's in it. And never, ever sweep after sunset. But what happens when practicality collides with belief? Imagine a housewife who spilled flour by the doorway as she finished her baking by lamplight. Her instinct may have been to tidy it at once. Flour was precious, after all. But her hand would pause. Was it worth the risk? The broom might twitch in the corner of her eye, but she would likely lay down a cloth instead, whispering to herself that morning wasn't far off. This belief also acted as a quiet form of social control. Just as certain clothing marked class or status, certain behaviors marked someone as respectable. A woman who swept at night might be gossiped about. Was she cursed? Was she careless? Did her family fall into illness because of her disregard? These were not accusations voiced aloud, but they lingered, shaping the way people acted. In some regions, there were further layers to the belief. A woman who swept at night might be accused of witchcraft, not because she was casting spells, but because she was acting against the natural order. In times when misfortune spread quickly, like crop failure or the death of livestock, suspicion always sought a cause. Superstition became a framework for understanding chaos. There were also symbolic interpretations of sweeping. To remove something with intention is to alter its fate. If you swept inward, you were inviting fortune in. If you swept outward, you were sending it away. Nighttime, already cloaked in uncertainty, only heightened these associations. Dust wasn't just dust. It was a metaphor for luck, vitality, and unseen blessings. In homes where coins were counted carefully, and every loaf of bread was accounted for, the broom became a tool of power, and misuse of it became dangerous. Yet despite the tension surrounding the act, no one outlawed it. There were no formal rules posted in churches or guild halls. This was a law of whisper and repetition. Grandmothers taught daughters. Neighbors reminded each other gently. If someone forgot, they didn't yell, they told a story. About the family whose child fell ill after the hearth was cleaned late. About the woman who lost her hens the morning after she swept her stoop in the dark. Always vague. Never provable. But still, the broom was left alone. The image of an untouched doorstep, even covered in dirt or leaves, tells us something about the rhythm of these lives. That routine wasn't just a matter of practicality, it was a form of protection. That even the most mundane actions, sweeping, stirring, lighting a lamp, carried meaning. And that fear, once woven into habit, becomes indistinguishable from wisdom. By the time morning arrived and the dew had settled, the broom would finally be picked up. Quietly, as if nothing had happened. The sun gave permission. The world was safe again. The family could breathe. The ritual had been observed. And so the dust remained until dawn. Not because they didn't notice it, but because they did. Seeing a hare cross your path meant a witch was near. It starts, as so many old beliefs do, with something small. A flicker of movement near the roadside hedge. A sudden dart across the path ahead. You pause, not because the creature is dangerous, but because of what it might represent. A hare. Quick, silent, gone in a heartbeat. But if you were walking a lonely track in 15th century England, that single moment might be enough to stop you in your tracks. The hare, to the medieval mind, was not just a woodland animal. It lived in the gray space between the wild and the unnatural. It was elusive, oddly silent, and moved in unpredictable patterns. Unlike the fox or the wolf, the hare was not feared for its teeth, but for its associations, for what it might become, or what it might already be. Imagine yourself walking in the pale morning light, perhaps toward the market or a neighboring village. The air is still. The road ahead is narrow, worn with cartwheel ruts and hoofprints. Your thoughts are simple: bread to trade, news to exchange, the usual rhythm of rural life. Then, just ahead, a hare leaps across the path. Nothing more than a blur of brown fur and sudden movement. But you stop, not out of curiosity, but caution, because in this time and place, that hare might not be a hare at all. Across much of medieval and early modern Europe, hares were deeply woven into folklore. They were said to be shapeshifters, favored disguises of witches traveling by night or fleeing detection. It was not uncommon to hear stories of women accused of running as hares to attend secret sabbats, or slipping away in hare form to avoid being caught. The reasoning, if one can call it that, came from observation. Hares were most active at dawn and dusk, what some called the in-between hours. Their movements were swift and erratic. They appeared and vanished, much like witches people thought. In parts of the British Isles, it was even said that if you harmed a hare and it limped away, the next day a local woman might be seen with a matching wound. A scratch, a limp, a bandaged leg. The implication was clear. The hare was the woman, and in wounding it, you had exposed her secret. Some stories go further still, suggesting that witches could summon hares as messengers or familiars, creatures that carried spells across fields and thresholds, unseen by most, believed by many. These weren't just tales told for amusement. They shaped behavior. In the English countryside, travelers who saw a hare cross their path might delay their journey, turn back, or pause to speak a quiet charm for protection. The risk wasn't physical harm. It was bewitchment, misfortune, or worse, attracting attention from forces that ought to remain undisturbed. Even among farmers and hunters, those who were most familiar with the ways of animals, the hare was treated with a strange sort of reverence. While hares were sometimes eaten, they were not trapped casually. In some areas, the belief held that eating a hare could cause dreams of witches, or even invite possession. Others insisted that a hare's heart, if found near a threshold, meant someone in the house had drawn unwanted attention from the unnatural world. What made these beliefs endure was their entanglement with lived experience. Hares were real. Witches, too, in the minds of many. And when a poor harvest followed a strange encounter on the road, or when a child fell ill after seeing a hare near the cottage, the cause seemed obvious. If it explained. The church, for its part, rarely encouraged these specific tales, but nor did it aggressively stamp them out. Superstition lived in the shadows of organized belief, often tolerated as long as it didn't challenge authority. And besides, much of the population couldn't read. Their world was passed on in sayings, signs, and shared warnings. Hares were simply part of that vocabulary. Some regions developed countermeasures. If you saw a hare cross your path, you might spit over your left shoulder, or turn around 3 times, or make the sign of the cross with a twig or a piece of straw. Others carried small tokens, pebbles, bits of iron, sprigs of certain herbs, to ward off harm. None of this was written in law, but it didn't need to be. The fear lived quietly, passed from mouth to mouth, woven into the rhythm of walking, watching, and remembering. Not all associations with hares were dark. In some older traditions, hares symbolized fertility and renewal. They were connected to spring festivals, to the rebirth of the land. But even then, the hare was never entirely safe, never fully tame. It belonged to the margins, to hedgerows and hollow ways, to dusk, and anything that lived in the in-between was suspect. Centuries later, the belief would fade, not vanish entirely, but retreat into old books and occasional sayings. The idea of witches turning into hares might seem quaint now, even poetic. But the instinct, the moment of hesitation when something crosses your path too quickly, still lingers in quiet places. Today, if a hare runs across your road, you might smile. You might keep walking. But somewhere in your bones, in that older part of your mind shaped by stories you don't remember learning, something might pause. Just for a moment. Not out of fear. Just awareness. A sense that you've entered one of those old, unspoken places, where roads are narrow, hedges tall, and the morning light casts long shadows. Opening an umbrella indoors invited illness into the house. Imagine a house just after rainfall. The shutters are damp, the hearth smolders faintly with the last of yesterday's ash, and along the entryway wall, a bundle leans gently, an umbrella. Not the folding kind you might know today, but a stiff, heavy structure of oiled cloth stretched across a frame of curved ribs. A rare thing. A symbol of dignity. But also, in many households, a deeply cautious object. You'd never dare open it inside. To do so, they believed, was to welcome sickness into the home. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. The act of spreading those ribs beneath a ceiling, beneath shelter, was said to unlock something unseen. It unsealed the safe barrier between the living space and the chaotic, damp world outside. Like opening a forbidden passage, or disturbing a fragile veil that kept illness at bay. It wasn't always spoken of in precise terms. Few would explain exactly how it worked, but you would hear the warnings. A child who opened an umbrella near the hearth might be hushed with unusual sharpness. A visiting aunt might scowl and make a quiet gesture to ward off misfortune. The fear was quiet but real. Of course, umbrellas themselves were uncommon. For much of European history, they were reserved for the well-to-do, particularly women of the elite. These parasols, as they were called in earlier centuries, were often more decorative than practical, used to shield the skin from the sun rather than the body from rain. In this sense, they were protectors of image, of status, even of health. Pale skin meant wealth. An umbrella ensured it stayed that way. But as time passed, rain protection became the priority, especially in the damp climates of Britain and the continent. By the 18th and 19th centuries, umbrellas began to appear among the middle classes, though they were still far from commonplace. The material had to be specially treated, the frame constructed with care. Each one felt deliberate, and with that sense of importance came caution. A tool designed to keep the elements out was never meant to be turned loose indoors. And so the superstition lingered. Opening one in the house was seen as disrupting the boundary between the protected world and the one from which you sought shelter. It was like summoning the storm inside, but slower, more insidious. Not thunder or wind, but coughs, fever, a subtle illness that took root silently. Some households believed the umbrella's ribs, those long spokes that clicked into place, resembled skeletal hands, stretching out to grasp what should remain untouched. Their sudden expansion, especially under a roof, was thought to jostle the air, stir the resting spirits, and unbalance the home's quiet harmony. Others claimed it was bad luck because the act simply defied the umbrella's purpose. You brought it into being in the wrong context. Like lighting a fire in the rain or drinking water from an empty cup, it went against its natural use, and the consequence was disorder. This belief may have also stemmed from an older architectural anxiety that some actions carried outdoors should never be mimicked indoors. Just as people would never whistle after dark inside the home, lest it call things best left outside, or sweep dust toward the hearth, lest it attract misfortune, so too the opening of an umbrella crossed an invisible threshold. It blurred inside and out, and illness, it was thought, like those places best. And illness was not an abstract fear. Most households had little recourse when sickness arrived. A cold could become fever. A fever could become crisis. In an age before antibiotics, before reliable doctors, before germ theory even had a name, prevention became something else. Habit, ritual, caution embedded in the bones of daily life. Not unlike the way we now knock on wood or avoid walking under ladders. But in a world of lower certainty and fewer remedies, these gestures held more weight. Interestingly, this superstition did not remain confined to any one culture. Across regions, from England to Eastern Europe, variations of the warning appeared. Some believed the act invited arguments and family discord. Others, particularly in the American South, said it would ensure someone in the household would fall ill before the week's end. In China and parts of Southeast Asia, the umbrella itself had associations with funerals and the spirit world, making its careless handling indoors all the more potent. Even as late as the 20th century, etiquette books gently advised against opening umbrellas indoors, not for reasons of courtesy, but for health and harmony. And in quiet corners, grandmothers and caretakers still looked sideways when someone flicked open an umbrella in the kitchen, even if just to dry it off. Perhaps you've even felt that pause yourself. The odd stillness when someone opens one beside a coat rack. The tension, barely named, that seems to ripple through the air. A gesture that is technically harmless, but still not quite right. In the end, it wasn't about the umbrella. It was about the home. A space that protected, embraced, and kept the world at bay. Every superstition, every small ritual, whether salt at the door, a broom behind the curtain, or shoes turned just so, served a deeper purpose. Not magic, not always fear, but order. In a world of uncertainty, those patterns brought comfort. So imagine the next time rain trails down the windows and someone returns with droplets clinging to their coat, their umbrella soaked and heavy in hand. Watch as they pause before entering. They shake it gently, close it tightly, and lean it in the corner, unopened. And perhaps, just perhaps, the house exhales in relief. Finding a knife on the threshold was a threat in disguise. Imagine a quiet morning in a medieval village. The sun has just begun to warm the mossy thatch roofs. Smoke curls gently from stone chimneys. A rooster crows in the distance, and the soft rhythm of chores, water being fetched, bread being kneaded, animals stirred from their pens, begins to ripple through the lanes. It is the kind of morning where most would hope for peace, routine, and small comforts. But as you step toward your door to begin the day, something halts you. Laid across the wooden threshold is a single knife. It has not been dropped or forgotten. It is too clean, too deliberate. Placed horizontally, just touching the base of the door, the blade points toward the open air as if in warning or challenge. No one is in sight, but you feel watched. In the rhythm of medieval life, this was no trivial sight. A knife on the threshold was more than a misplaced tool. It was a symbol, a message, often a threat. Throughout much of medieval Europe, thresholds were not merely functional. They were deeply symbolic, the thin boundary between the world outside and the world within. What crossed it or what was placed upon it held meaning. To leave something on another's threshold was to communicate without words. And when that object was a knife, the message was rarely benign. Knives in the medieval world were everywhere. They were not just weapons, but tools for cutting bread, skinning game, repairing tack, carving wood. Most men and many women carried small utility blades, tucked into belts or aprons. But to place one deliberately, unsheathed and visible, at someone's door was a calculated act. It meant something had been severed, a relationship, a bond, a promise. And sometimes the implication was darker, that harm was intended and the knife's presence marked the first cut. In many rural regions, it was believed that leaving a blade at a doorway could invite misfortune into the home. The blade, especially if pointing inward, might cut the harmony of the household. It could divide spouses, bring sickness, or invite spiritual interference. In some traditions, the knife acted as a sort of magical sigil, directing negative energy toward those inside. No words needed to be spoken. No confrontation required. This kind of silent aggression had its uses. In small villages where social balance was fragile, where insults echoed for generations and disputes flared over boundary stones and grazing rights, open conflict could be dangerous. A silent gesture, ominous but deniable, allowed tensions to be expressed without violence. Yet the unease it created could linger for days, even weeks. Imagine the inner life of someone who finds such a knife. They might step over it carefully, or not enter at all. They might scan the horizon for movement. Later, they might consult a village elder, or burn herbs by the door. Perhaps the blade is buried beneath a tree, or washed in river water, as an attempt to cleanse the implied curse. Whatever the response, one thing is certain, the household will not forget. Even more than curses, the knife might signal personal betrayal. In feudal households, if a servant or retainer was dismissed in shame, or left under bitter terms, they might return the next morning and lay their knife across the master's threshold. It meant, we are no longer bound. The blade, once a symbol of loyalty or duty, was now a division, a severance of fealty. In this context, the knife was not just an object, it was a break in the social contract. Among close neighbors or former friends, a knife might appear following a dispute too deep for mending. The message was unspeakable in public but clear in symbol. Trust was gone, and if one was not careful, safety might follow. Interestingly, this tradition had its inverse too. In some regions, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe, placing a knife beneath the threshold, hidden, unseen, was considered a protective act. Wives, mothers, and wise women might do so after a child's illness or a difficult birth. The belief was that iron repelled spirits, and the threshold was the entry point for anything that meant harm. This contrast only deepened the unease of finding a blade on the surface, exposed. It was not protection. It was provocation. There are accounts, though rare, of such gestures being recorded in legal disputes. In one 14th century town ledger from Flanders, a merchant accused his neighbor of threatening him after finding a knife across his door 3 mornings in a row. Though no direct accusation was made, the court agreed that the gesture implied malice, and the neighbor was fined for disturbing the peace. Not all knives were literal threats, of course. A misplaced blade or a child's prank could spark unnecessary fear. But in an age where symbols mattered as much as speech, and where superstition and custom ruled behavior more than written law, it was rarely dismissed outright. Even noble households weren't immune. In castles and manors, where disputes often held higher stakes, over land, inheritance, or loyalty, a knife at the door might be interpreted with grim seriousness. A rival knight might send such a message before challenging another's claim. A servant might use the gesture to mark an accusation they could not safely speak aloud. Rumors followed such incidents. Servants whispered. Guests declined invitations. The air of threat, once introduced, was hard to dispel. Today, such a symbol might seem quaint. We live in a world where messages are instant, legal threats are drafted by professionals, and doorways rarely hold symbolic power. But some of the old customs linger in shadow. We still say that a knife given as a gift must be accompanied by a coin, lest it sever friendship. We still have phrases like a dagger in the back, or crossing a line, which echo the silent, symbolic gestures of old. And even now, to find a sharp object placed at your door, deliberately, silently, would feel unnerving. Perhaps it's not the blade itself that disturbs us, but the weight of what it implies. That something has been broken. That someone is watching. That the doorway between peace and peril is thinner than we'd like to believe. And so, in the stillness of a medieval morning, when the knife lay across the threshold, the message was understood without sound. Walk carefully, it's it. Ties have been cut. What was once safe may no longer be. And everyone inside knew the rhythm of their lives had shifted, quietly, dangerously, just beyond the door. Hearing a dog howl 3 times foretold family tragedy. Imagine yourself lying on a straw-stuffed mattress in a small wooden house at the edge of a quiet village. The fire has gone out, but its scent still lingers, smoke and ash and the faint sweetness of pine. Outside, it is the hour before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath. And then, from somewhere in the dark, you hear it. One low, hollow howl. Then another. And then a third. The dog's cry rises and falls like a tide through the silence. Not a bark, not a growl, but something drawn out, stretched across the stillness like a thread. Inside the cottage, no one moves at first. But the quiet has shifted. And every ear, whether waking or dreaming, knows what they've just heard. In many parts of early Europe, and well into the 19th century in rural communities, this sound was not just unnerving. It was a sign, a message, a warning that death or great loss was near. Dogs were not merely animals. They were watchers, sentinels between the living and the dead. People believed they could sense what others could not, the shifting of spirits, the approach of illness, the quiet step of tragedy before it entered the home. A single howl might be brushed off. Perhaps the dog saw a shadow or heard something out on the road. But 3 howls, in succession, especially in the hours just before sunrise, this was different. It was said the veil between worlds was thinnest at that time. If a dog howled 3 times, it meant the boundary had been breached. This belief was not confined to one region. Across medieval England, in the highlands of Scotland, in the mountain villages of Germany and the farms of rural France, the pattern repeats. The triple howl, the dread, the expectation of loss. Dogs were thought to see what others could not, and once they howled, something had already begun. The The cause of the belief may lie in the nature of the howl itself. There is something uncanny in it. Unlike a bark, which responds to the visible, or a growl, which warns off danger, a howl seems to reach for something unseen. It echoes. It lingers. It seems to call, or respond, to silence itself. In households where superstition shaped daily life, the response to a dog's triple howl was nearly ritualistic. Families might light a candle immediately and set it by the window to ward off spirits. Others would whisper a protective prayer or scatter salt across the threshold. In some places, neighbors, having heard the same sound, would quietly rise from bed and dress, not out of fear, but out of a quiet obligation. They would walk, slowly and softly, to the house from which the sound had come and wait with the family, just in case. These gatherings were rarely dramatic. There was no wailing, no open discussion of what was feared. People simply arrived. They sat in kitchens or leaned against door frames. They drank warm beer or poured water. They spoke in hushed voices about ordinary things. But always they waited. And more often than not, by the next sundown, news would come. A messenger at the gate. A horse returning riderless. A fever that took hold and could not be turned. The dog, they would say, had known. In villages where burial rites were central to the rhythm of life, the connection between dogs and death became more formal. Some believed that each household's dog was spiritually tied to its members. When one person fell ill, the dog might grow restless. When death was near, it might howl, not out of distress, but as a kind of announcement. Not to warn the family, but to mark the event. Interestingly, the belief was not always seen as a curse. Some viewed the triple howl not as a cause of tragedy, but as a kindness. The dog had seen something coming and had chosen to speak. It gave the living time to prepare, to gather, to comfort, to pray. In this way, the animal was seen not just as a companion, but as a bridge, a gentle guardian between one world and the next. Of course, not all howls were seen this way. A daytime bark, even a long one, was ordinary. But it was the specific combination, the 3 howls just before dawn, that carried weight. It became embedded in community memory. Years later, someone might recall, that winter, the dog howled 3 times, and by spring, we had lost 2 from the household. Memory wrapped itself around the sound like ivy around stone. Children were taught to respect it early. Grandmothers would hush little ones when the dog howled at night. Don't speak, they'd say, not until it stops. The sound was sacred in a way, not to be mocked, not to be ignored. There was a silence that followed it, like the hush after a bell tolls at a funeral. In more isolated places, where formal churches were hours away and professional clergy rare, the spiritual role of the dog took on even greater meaning. For families who buried their own and whispered their own rites, a dog's howl might be the only warning they received. In a world where news traveled slowly and danger arrived quickly, even an animal's voice became part of the system of survival. Interestingly, this idea, that animals sense death, continues into the modern day. Even now, in hospitals and care homes, stories circulate of pets who refuse to leave the side of someone near the end, or who grow strangely quiet just hours before a passing. The belief may no longer carry the same weight, but it has not vanished. Today, we are more likely to attribute a dog's howling to sound frequencies, to instinct, to changes in the environment. But in a time before science could name those causes, people filled the silence with meaning. And in doing so, they created rituals, not just to explain tragedy, but to soften it. The triple howl became a signal, not of horror, but of presence. A sign that something was moving, gently, between realms. That a life might soon leave, and those left behind should begin their vigil. That the veil was lifting, if only for a moment. And then, once the sound faded, the stillness returned. But no one slept quite as easily again that night. Rain falling while the sun shone was a sign of a devil's wedding. Imagine yourself standing in the doorway of a small medieval cottage. The hour is quiet, between work and supper, and the fields are bathed in a warm golden light. Birds are still singing, the leaves unmoving on the branches, and yet, softly, almost politely, the rain begins to fall. Not a storm, not a downpour. Just a light, steady sunlit drizzle. You might think it beautiful, but if you were born in another century, into a world lit by fire instead of electricity, you wouldn't marvel at it. You'd shut the door. In many villages, across Europe and beyond, the sight of rain falling while the sun still shone wasn't charming. It was chilling. People whispered that such weather meant the devil was getting married. A wedding, yes, but not the kind where music played and garlands were hung. This was a dark, invisible ritual, one believed to take place somewhere far from human eyes, deep in the forest or the empty fields, beneath sun and rain, with guests too strange to name. It's easy, now, to forget how much weather once meant. For most of history, rain wasn't just a mood. It was food. It was danger. It was mystery. Weather patterns weren't tracked by satellites or forecasts. They were read from the color of clouds, the behavior of animals, or the way smoke curled from a chimney. So when two weather signs collided, sun and rain together, it felt unnatural, wrong even, and anything that defied nature's rhythm was suspect. In this unsettled moment, a child might be pulled quickly from the yard. An older neighbor might murmur a protective prayer. Curtains, if there were any, would be drawn. Doors closed. It wasn't fear of getting wet, it was fear of being watched. Because when the devil wed, it was said he didn't want witnesses. This belief wasn't localized to one small place. Variations appeared across cultures. In parts of England and Ireland, they spoke of witches or foxes getting married. In Germany, it might be a wolf's wedding. In Hungary, a ghost's. In India and Africa, the stories differed but shared the same core idea. When the sky behaved in contradictions, so did the world beneath it. And whatever ceremony was occurring beneath that strange weather was best left undisturbed. Imagine a woman hanging laundry in the yard, pausing when she feels the first drops. The sun still blazes. There is no warning thunder, no scent of earth yet. Just an eerie, wrong sort of rain. She doesn't curse the weather, she watches it. Then, methodically, she gathers her things and goes inside. Not because she believes in demons, but because everyone she has ever known has said, "Don't linger when the devil takes a bride." It was never clear who the devil's bride was supposed to be. Sometimes the folklore named a witch. Sometimes a fox in disguise. Sometimes it was symbolic, a marriage between things that should never mix. Light and darkness. Fire and water. Seen and unseen. And always, the event was meant to happen without humans looking. To watch too long, they believed, was to invite misfortune into your home. Crops might fail. A cow might stop giving milk. A child might fall ill. And no one could prove it had anything to do with the sun shower, but then again, no one could say it didn't. Children especially were warned to come indoors. Not just for safety, but because children were believed to be more vulnerable to influence. More easily tempted. More likely to be noticed. And so a sunlit rain became a quiet signal. Come in, look away, and don't ask questions. In places where literacy was rare and science distant, these stories provided structure. They weren't meant to frighten as much as to explain. How could rain fall from a sky so clear and warm? Why would something as ordinary as weather feel so strange, so quiet, and yet so heavy? The answer didn't come from physics or meteorology. It came from myth. Because myth fills the gaps between pattern and meaning. Sometimes the devil's wedding was described with odd details. Bells said to ring faintly from nowhere. A dog howling once, then falling silent. A whirlwind in the corner of a field that vanished too quickly. These were not daily tales. They were shared in low voices, at the end of long days, or around a low fire when nothing else stirred. They gave the world shape, rules, consequences. They made the rain more than rain. Of course, not everyone believed it. There were skeptics even in the oldest villages. But belief isn't always required. Behavior often survives belief. People might say they didn't believe, but they'd still close the shutters, just in case. They'd still pull the child back from the gate. Because history is made not just by what people thought, but by what they did without thinking. Even today, traces of this folklore remain. In parts of the southern United States, older generations still say that the devil is beating his wife when sun and rain arrive together. In other places, the moment is called a fox's wedding or a monkey's marriage. The devil's name may have faded, but the structure of the story, the sense that something eerie is happening behind the veil, remains. So the next time you stand under a sunshower and feel both warmth and rain on your skin, pause for a moment. You are touching something very old. A weather pattern, yes, but also a whisper passed down through centuries. That not all unions are visible, that not all ceremonies need guests, and that somewhere, beyond the trees or beneath the soil, the devil may still be choosing his bride. But the lesson, simple and soft as rain on a warm afternoon, is the same now as it was then. When the world feels off-kilter, even in small ways, step back. Let it pass. Watch the sky from behind glass. And wait for the rain to stop before you go out again. Crossing a funeral path twice invited the same fate. It was just a road, worn smooth by cartwheels, hooves, and boots. A familiar stretch of dirt between one village and the next. But on certain days, it became something more. When the bells tolled low and slow, and figures in dark shawls gathered near the church gate, the road changed. It became a passage, not just for the living but for the dead. In many rural corners of medieval Europe, the route taken by a funeral procession was more than a path. It was sacred ground. Not blessed in the way a church might be, but set apart nonetheless. A temporary threshold between the earthly and the eternal. And to cross that path not once, but twice, was to court something deeply feared, invitation. The belief was simple, but heavy. If you unknowingly crossed a funeral route twice, once as it was being prepared, and again after the procession had passed, it was said you had bound yourself to the same fate. Early death, marked not by sin or crime, but by proximity. As if the soul being carried had reached out and quietly taken a companion for the journey. Imagine yourself walking a narrow lane at dawn. There's frost still clinging to the edges of stone. You hear the church bell strike once, then twice. Far ahead, around a bend, the first signs of a procession emerge. A wooden bier, black cloth, slow steps. You freeze. Not out of disrespect, but from calculation. Had you passed this way earlier this morning? Had your steps already touched that route before the bell rang? People took this belief seriously. If there was even a chance you'd cross a funeral path more than once, you were expected to alter your plans. Take a longer road. Wait for dusk. Even cancel your journey altogether. This wasn't mere superstition. It was habit, built into the rhythm of rural life. A small inconvenience was far better than being marked by the dead. The origins of this belief are difficult to trace precisely. It likely grew from older ideas about liminal spaces, thresholds where normal rules didn't apply. Crossroads, graveyards, doorways at midnight. A funeral procession belonged to that category. It wasn't just people moving from one place to another. It was a ritual, a moment suspended between life and death. To interfere with that, even unintentionally, was to disturb the balance. Some said it wasn't the dead who chose to take you, but the road itself. That once a soul had passed along it, the path retained a trace of that passage. A kind of spiritual residue. Cross it once and you were safe. But cross it twice, once before and once after, and the pattern formed a loop. A circle. And circles, in many traditions, are binding. This idea wasn't confined to just one region. In parts of rural France, there were tales of those who ignored the rule and fell ill within a week. In the Scottish Highlands, old women were known to shout warnings to travelers, "Mind the dead road, mind it twice." And in English country parishes, church records occasionally mention roads being left clear on funeral days, not for traffic, but out of quiet dread. Even among those who didn't believe in omens, there was a social pressure to comply. A neighbor who repeatedly walked across a funeral path might be whispered about. Careless, they'd say, or worse, fucked. In a world where illness came swiftly and death was rarely explained, people clung to patterns, to cause and effect, even when uncertain. The precautions were subtle but firm. A traveler might wait near a hedgerow until the procession passed and the road felt cold again. A child who skipped across the path twice might be scolded and made to sit silently at the hearth, while salt was sprinkled near the threshold. These weren't acts of panic. They were small, ritualistic corrections. just enough to reset whatever had been set in motion. And then there were the bells. Funeral bells, or passing bells, rang differently from the usual calls to prayer. Slower, deeper. In some towns, the bell would toll once for every year the deceased had lived. In others, it was a fixed pattern: 3 slow strikes for a woman, 4 for a man. The sound wasn't just a signal of loss. It was also a warning: stay off the road. Let the dead pass undisturbed. And do not cross again until the echo fades. In some rare cases, legends grew around those who violated the rule. A miller who walked across the procession path twice and was found a month later, drowned at his own wheel. A midwife who forgot the route and doubled back, only to fall ill for a full season. These stories weren't always true, but they didn't need to be. Their repetition gave shape to an otherwise invisible boundary. It's worth remembering that in this time, death was far more present. Children died young. Accidents were common. Medicine was sparse. And funerals were not distant ceremonies. They were communal events, witnessed by all. To see a neighbor carried down the lane, wrapped in linen, followed by weeping relatives, was not unusual. It was woven into life. And that's perhaps why these boundaries mattered so much. They gave people a small measure of control. A belief that, by obeying certain quiet rules, they might delay their own crossing. Today, the roads are paved. The bells are automated. Funerals, while still solemn, are often private. And the idea of a funeral path being dangerous has long since faded. But if you walk a quiet village road at dusk and hear a slow bell toll in the distance, something may still stir. You might look down at the path and wonder, not with fear, but with a kind of ancestral memory, if your steps are safe. If you've walked this way before. And if so, whether you should walk it again. Knocking on wood was essential to block evil spirits. Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval chapel. The sermon is nearly finished. A priest, robed and solemn, speaks of the harvest to come. Perhaps it will be bountiful, he says. A murmur passes through the listeners. But before he moves on, he reaches out and lightly taps the wooden edge of the pulpit with his fingers. Just once. Just enough. Then he continues. It doesn't seem like much. A simple knock. No words, no gesture. But in that single act lived a deep, unspoken ritual, one that crossed borders, generations, and even belief systems. It was the reflex of protection, so common that it rarely needed explanation. To speak of good things, luck, health, survival, without following with a tap on wood was to risk inviting the very opposite. In the Middle Ages and well beyond, wood was not just material. It was boundary, it was protection, and in some traditions, it was alive. Homes were built from it. Doors and floors and beams bore witness to every birth and burial, every storm and feast. And it was said, quietly, without drama, that spirits listened. Not always with malice, but with interest. And so, people knocked. Not in the way you might knock to enter, but a more subtle touch. After a hopeful word, a boast, or even a wish, the hand would drift toward the table, the post, the wall, the cart handle. Any surface of wood. A quick rap or a soft brush. And then silence again. Some believed this action warded off envy, not of people, but of the unseen. That to speak confidently was to shine too brightly, and the knock was a way of dimming that light, just enough to escape notice. It was humility in motion. Others thought the knock summoned the protective spirits within the wood itself, especially if it came from a living tree. Trees, in many ancient cultures, were thought to house guardians, ancestors, even fragments of divinity. And when a tree was felled and shaped into timber, a part of that presence remained. Over time, this act transformed from pagan tradition to everyday reflex. By the medieval period, even devout Christians, those who did not speak of tree spirits or nature deities, still knocked. The act had outlived its original meaning. It had become part of the rhythm of speech, a buffer between language and fate. Imagine two neighbors speaking beside a fence. One says her son has been healthy all winter. Then, almost without thinking, she touches the gatepost beside her. A light tap. She doesn't explain it. She doesn't need to. The other woman does the same. The conversation continues. In kitchens, in workshops, Even on long roads where travelers paused by wooden signposts to share good news, the same gesture would follow. A story told, a hope shared, and then a knock. The world was filled with uncertainty. Superstition, in the modern sense, was not merely belief in the irrational. It was insurance. Quiet, habitual, and rarely questioned. And while it is tempting to see this only through the lens of folklore, there's something deeper in the act. What surrounded daily life. It was the material of plows, of ladders, of cradles. It creaked underfoot and above. It expanded in damp and shrank in drought. To knock on it was to speak to the fabric of daily life itself. As if to say, bear witness, hold this truth safe, let this moment pass without harm. Not all wood was equal, of course. Some trees were said to be more powerful. Oak, especially, held strong associations with protection and divine favor. Ash, too, was thought to carry healing energy. In older times, knocking on living trees, particularly in sacred groves, was part of broader rituals. You didn't just ask for protection. You asked to be heard. As time passed, the superstition evolved. In some places, the knock was replaced by a touch. In others, it was paired with a spoken phrase, God willing, or if fate allows. But even as the gestures changed, the meaning remained. To shield oneself from the consequences of hope. To seal the door after the good news had escaped. The custom found its way into all walks of life. Sailors knocked on masts before departure. Farmers tapped fence posts after predicting fair weather. Soldiers, in quiet barracks, rapped on bed frames before speaking of safe returns. Even clergy, who formally denounced superstition, found their fingers drawn now and then to the carved wood of the altar or pulpit, especially after saying something bold about the days ahead. The fear wasn't always of punishment. More often, it was of imbalance. That to say too much, to dream too openly, was to tilt the scales. And so the knock set things right. It didn't erase the wish. It just made it less vulnerable. Today, you might still hear it. In a conversation over tea, someone says they haven't been sick in years, and knocks the table. Or after a good bit of luck, a person might joke, knock on wood, while doing just that. The phrase has outlasted the belief. But beneath it, the instinct remains. You could call it superstition. You could call it folklore. Or you could simply call it a memory, one so old and quiet that it now moves through us without sound. A way of honoring the past while hedging against the future. A touch, a tap, and the hope that whatever is listening chooses not to answer. And so, picture the next time you speak of something going well, an uneventful trip, a peaceful night, a bit of luck in uncertain times. Your fingers might, before you even think to question it, reach for the closest piece of wood. And somewhere, deep in the grain, something ancient listens and stays silent. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant death in the family. Imagine waking before dawn in a room lit only by the fading glow of a fire. The coals have burned low. The air is cold against your skin. Somewhere nearby, a rooster has not yet crowed. And yet, your heart is already heavy. You sit up slowly, the weight of a dream clinging to your thoughts like fog. You don't remember all of it. Only the end. The moment your teeth fell from your mouth, one by one, into your open hands. And you know what it means. Someone close to you is going to die. In the medieval world, dreams were never taken lightly. They were seen not as nonsense or mere fragments of memory, but as visitations, omens, sometimes warnings from realms beyond daily life. For a world where death was never far, the idea that the sleeping mind could receive news from fate, or from heaven, or from spirits, was both terrifying and reassuring. If the waking world could not always be controlled, perhaps the dreaming one offered glimpses of what lay ahead. And among all the dreams that stirred dread, none was more feared than this, the dream of teeth falling out. It was a vision described across Europe again and again. A woman waking from sleep, whispering to her husband that her teeth had dropped into her lap. A shepherd returning from the field early, haunted by a dream of spitting teeth into a bowl. A child saying they dreamed of biting into bread and finding their own molars inside. Always, the meaning was the same. A death in the family. Not always immediate, but soon. The teeth might fall out painlessly, or they might crack and crumble. Some said they dropped into the dreamer's hands. Others said they turned to dust. But the result never changed. The dream was an omen. And in a world already familiar with sudden loss, the symbolism resonated deeply. Teeth, after all, held meaning beyond the body. They were markers of vitality, of strength, age, and survival. A child's first teeth were celebrated. An elder's last ones mourned in silence. Losing them in waking life could mean pain, shame, even difficulty eating. But losing them in dreams? That was something older. Something older than medicine. Older than logic. In rural homes and small villages, there were rituals meant to soften the blow. A person who dreamed of losing teeth might begin the day in silence. They might fast until sunset or eat only white food. In some places, they walked backward to the edge of the village and buried a pinch of salt beneath a tree, murmuring a name they hoped to protect. In others, they made small offerings at the hearth, bits of bread, sprigs of dried herbs, or water left overnight in a wooden bowl. No one admitted they believed the dream. Not aloud. But neither did they ignore it. Even in noble households, the anxiety took hold. Ladies of the court recorded such dreams in their journals, noting the dates and outcomes. Clerics warned against dream interpretation in sermons, but also documented the same symbols in quiet texts passed hand to hand. In one surviving manuscript from the 13th century, a monk in York carefully catalogued over 60 dream signs and their meanings. Teeth lost without pain, he wrote, is the passing of blood kin. Teeth broken is harm to the household. It was not just personal. The dream reached into the life of the whole family. Imagine a mother waking to that vision. She says nothing, but watches her children more closely that morning. Listens for coughs. Notices the paleness of her husband's face. The dream plants a seed of vigilance, or perhaps helplessness. It lingers throughout the day like a faint ringing in the ears. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes someone does fall ill. And the dream is remembered again, not as coincidence, but as confirmation. The line between superstition and faith was thin in those years. For some, dreams were a divine gift. For others, they were traps, temptations. The church often condemned dream meaning as a kind of vanity or even heresy. And yet, many of the same clergy recorded their own dreams or interpreted those of others when pressed. It is difficult to separate belief from habit. Most families did not speak openly of these things, but they acted, and action was its own kind of confession. In some households, there was a practice of whispering dreams into a spoon before breakfast, then washing the spoon in clean water. In others, the dreamer would braid a red thread into their sleeve for a day, or place a single coin beneath the pillow the following night, as a way of paying the dream off, so to speak, bribing fate to look elsewhere. It's important to understand that this fear was not theatrical. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, lived, and often private. A single dream could weigh upon a family for weeks. Conversations would slow. Meals might be eaten in silence. And when news finally came that a cousin had died or a grandparent had taken ill, the dream returned. Not as prophecy fulfilled, but as a story that had already begun in sleep. Today, we might dismiss such dreams. Modern psychology tells us they reflect anxiety, powerlessness, perhaps even loss of control. But for people who lived in a world where disease and famine could arrive without warning, where the body's fragility was known from birth, the dream of falling teeth was not a mystery of the mind. It was a signal. And perhaps, in their way, these dreams gave people something useful, not certainty, but preparation. A way to begin grieving early. A way to hold one's family a little closer, even if nothing could be done. In that sense, the dream was not a curse, but a door. A way to cross, gently, from the illusion of safety to the truth of life's impermanence. So if you were to walk through a medieval village just before dawn, and pass a household where the fire burned low and no one yet stirred, and you noticed a single person seated near the hearth, awake before all others, their eyes distant, you might wonder what dream had visited them in the night, and whether, somewhere in the quiet rhythm of their lives, something precious had already begun to slip away. Owls calling near a home portended sickness. Imagine yourself sitting by a hearth in the last blue hour of dusk. The flames have grown low, casting a warm but flickering light across a simple wooden floor. Shadows stretch long along the beams overhead. The wind is quiet. The house is still. And then, from the trees beyond the field, you hear it. A low, haunting hoot. Then again. And finally, a third time, longer, drawn out over the hush of evening. The owl is near. Too near. In many rural communities throughout medieval and early modern Europe, this sound was not heard as a part of nature, but as a signal, quiet, eerie, and deeply unsettling. The owl was not just a bird of the night. It was a messenger, a creature that moved between realms. And when it called near your home after dark, it was taken as a warning that illness, or even death, might soon follow. The superstition surrounding owls stretches back far before the medieval period. The ancient Romans associated owls with doom, often believing their cries foretold the passing of emperors. In Celtic folklore, owls were watchers of the soul. And by the time these beliefs filtered through generations into the villages of England, Germany, France, and beyond, a kind of quiet fear had settled around them. To hear an owl at dusk wasn't necessarily unusual, but to hear it calling again and again close to the house, this was something else entirely. The cry of an owl at your doorstep was said to be the voice of a spirit taking notice of your household. It didn't matter if the bird meant no harm. Its presence, its sound, marked your home as vulnerable. And so, families responded, not with panic, but with old, careful ritual. Bread was set on the threshold, sometimes a bowl of milk. These offerings weren't for the owl itself. They were for whatever unseen forces might have arrived with it. Spirits, misfortune, ancestral visitations. It varied from place to place. But the logic was the same. Appease what you cannot see before it enters through the door. In some areas, the act of placing bread outside was accompanied by a whispered plea, "Let this pass us by." The bread might be broken into 3 pieces. The milk poured in silence. In certain regions, women would sweep the doorstep backwards, pushing invisible harm away from the home with the bristles of a worn broom. Children were taught early to still their voices if they heard an owl. No pointing, no mimicking, no calling back. The bird was to be acknowledged silently, but never directly addressed. To speak of it was to give it power, and to laugh at it was seen as inviting the very thing it warned of. There were those who believed the owl saw sickness before it arrived. Others thought it carried it. Either way, the line between symbol and source was blurred. A fever that took hold the next day, or a child's sudden shivering, would be traced back to the night before, the call in the dark, and what followed. These beliefs were not entirely without pattern. Owls, after all, hunt near human settlements. Where there are mice and warmth, owls follow. And their haunting calls often do come when the wind is stillest and the air coldest, times when illness tends to stir. The mind, already wary of winter's approach, easily joins these dots. In the absence of medicine or certainty, a sound becomes a symbol. A hoot becomes a herald. In larger villages, the arrival of an owl might ripple through the neighborhood. An elder might rise from bed and murmur a prayer. A neighbor might wake before sunrise and leave a small loaf on a fence post, not for nourishment, but for prevention. Bread given to the night might keep the household safe until morning. These quiet acts of fear became quiet acts of community. No one would speak of it openly, but the signs were there, telltale scraps of bread near every doorstep. Interestingly, not all views of owls were entirely grim. In some regions, they were seen as protectors of secrets, or as wise creatures sent to warn. But even then, their warnings were not pleasant. To be warned was to be marked. And so the rituals continued. Better to be cautious, to feed the silence, than to tempt fate. In forested areas, particularly where homes bordered woods, owl calls were more common. And so the villagers there developed stronger practices. Wreaths of rosemary and rowan were hung near windows. A pinch of salt might be scattered on the windowsill. These were not grand ceremonies. They were small gestures, embedded in daily life, passed down from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. And still, even with all these layers of belief, life continued. The owl would call, the bread would be offered, the children would sleep a little closer to the fire. And in the morning, if nothing had changed, there was relief. But also, the memory. Because the owl's call was not easily forgotten. Its voice carried not just across fields, but through time, embedding itself in the rhythm of the household. Even today, the call of an owl at night can stir something old in the back of the mind. A subtle discomfort, the pause. Most no longer leave offerings. But some still close the window. Some still whisper an old phrase. Even now, the owl is more than a bird. It is a remnant, a fragment of a world where the night had meanings too layered to name. And so the hearth returns to quiet. The house settles again. But in the field, the owl watches. It does not mean harm. It does not seek it. But it has spoken. And someone, somewhere, listens. Planting during the waning moon was thought to doom crops. Imagine standing at the edge of a field in the early springtime. The soil is freshly turned, dark and rich beneath your feet. The air carries the cold memory of winter, but small buds have begun to appear along the hedgerows, and the birds sing with tentative hope. Everything seems ready for planting, but the seeds remain in their sacks. Not because the tools are broken, or because the laborers are absent, but because the moon is waning. For much of pre-modern history, the moon was not simply a presence in the sky. It was a clock, a signal, a silent authority. Before mechanical timepieces or printed calendars, it was the moon that told people when to gather, when to hunt, and, critically, when to plant. And its shrinking, fading phase, the waning moon, was not a time of action, but of restraint. To sow seeds during the waning moon, it was believed, would doom the crop to weakness. Growth would be stunted. Germination might fail entirely. What rose from the ground would be thin, bitter, or too frail to survive a full season. The logic was not framed in scientific terms, but in metaphors deeply rooted in rhythm and reflection. As the moon shrank in the sky, so too would the life force of anything newly begun. It was a time for drawing in, not reaching out. This wasn't a superstition limited to a single region or century. From rural England to the rice fields of Asia, from Mediterranean olive groves to Baltic potato plots, countless farming communities across the world watched the lunar cycle with quiet intensity. They couldn't afford not to. In a world where harvest failure meant hunger, sometimes starvation, no detail was too small, no pattern too obscure. The phases of the moon were more than markings in the sky. They were thought to hold influence over water, growth, birth, and decay. And so, in the waxing phase, when the moon grew brighter and rounder each night, farmers planted crops that bore fruit above ground: beans, wheat, tomatoes, even flowers. This was the time for action, expansion, emergence. But as soon as the full moon passed and the light began to fade, tools were laid aside. The fields rested. This was not laziness. It was caution. Planting during the waning moon was not simply frowned upon, it was feared. A farmer who defied this rhythm risked more than personal failure. His neighbors might whisper, his judgment questioned, and if his crop withered, it would not be seen as bad luck, but as a consequence, an avoidable mistake. Just as one did not sweep at night, or speak aloud during an eclipse, one did not bury seed into a withdrawing earth. The belief extended even further. During the final days of the moon's cycle, the dark moon, when it was no longer visible in the sky, some farmers refused to enter the field at all. It was a time of endings, not beginnings. A time for pruning, harvesting, or closing gates. And so the land waited, not from neglect, but from reverence, because the moon had to lead. Imagine the quiet tension of such waiting. A farmer leaning on his spade, glancing at the sky each night, counting days not with numbers but with light. Perhaps his grain stores are low. Perhaps his wife reminds him of last year's hard season. But still he waits. The soil may be ready, the weather perfect, but the moon is not. And he has seen what happens to those who push too soon. Some kept charts. Others used carved sticks, marked with the cycle. In later centuries, almanacs would be printed, offering guidance on which days to plant, which to weed, and which to avoid altogether. But long before the printed word, the knowledge passed from father to son, from old woman to young bride. This is when the moon helps. That is when it harms. Watch, wait, trust. Interestingly, some crops were believed to benefit from the waning moon, specifically those that grew below the ground. Root vegetables like carrots, onions, or beets. In these cases, the logic reversed. As the moon pulled inward, so did the energy of the plant, sinking deep into the earth. And so even the waning moon had its place, its purpose. But always, the key was alignment. Not haste, not defiance, but moving with the moon rather than against it. The idea that the heavens could affect the harvest might seem quaint now. We know that lunar gravity affects tides, but soil moisture? Root development? Modern science is skeptical. And yet, even now, some gardeners and farmers still follow the old rules. Not necessarily because they believe, but because it costs nothing to wait a few days. Because tradition is a kind of inheritance. And because rhythms, even uncertain ones, are comforting. What's perhaps most striking is how universal this was. Across continents, without contact, communities came to the same conclusion, that the moon's growing light meant growth, and its fading light meant retreat. It suggests a kind of shared intuition, an ancient agreement between humans and sky. And so when the moon waned, the fields lay still. The birds continued their songs, and the wind passed over untouched furrows. Life did not stop, but it paused. It listened. It waited. And when the first crescent returned, thin and bright in the western sky, the seeds were finally sown. Eating before the first church bell invited divine displeasure, in the stillness before dawn, the world held its breath. Chimney smoke had not yet curled into the sky. Hearths, though warm from the night's embers, were quiet. Roosters might crow early, and cattle might stir in their stalls. But the true beginning of the village day came not from nature, but from sound. A slow, deliberate ringing. The first church bell. And until that bell rang, no one, at least not openly, ate. To break one's fast before the first bell was not only discouraged. In many places, it was believed to draw down divine displeasure. Not a bolt of lightning or a sudden curse. Just quiet disapproval. A sort of spiritual shadow that might linger through the day. It was, in the minds of many villagers, a sign of greed. Of placing the body's wants before the soul's rhythm. And so people waited. Imagine yourself as a child in a medieval cottage. You've woken early, drawn by the smell of bread just beginning to bake. You're hungry. Not the restless hunger of boredom, but the ache of real need, familiar and dull. You know the bread is close, but your hands remain folded. Your mother is kneeling by the hearth, humming under her breath. Your father stares into the fire. No one speaks. All wait for the same thing. The first bell from the church down the hill. The custom wasn't written into law, but it was practiced with the certainty of one. In many villages across medieval Europe, the first bell of the day served as a communal signal. Its tones marked not only the time, but the acceptable beginning of daily life, both spiritual and physical. Only after the bell rang would people break their night's fast. Only then would crusts be passed and bowls filled. It wasn't just about discipline. It was about reverence. The bell itself had many purposes. It called the faithful to prayer. It marked the passing of hours. It warned of fire or invasion. But the earliest bell, often rung before the sun crested the horizon, had a more subtle power. It reset the rhythm of the village, aligning each household with the church's unseen authority. To eat before that signal was to step outside that rhythm. And in a tightly ordered world, that was no small thing. There were exceptions, of course. The very old, the sick, infants, whose cries were tended quietly in corners. But for most, even the hunger of children was tempered by custom. A child who reached too soon for a bite might be gently corrected, told to wait, told that God sees all moments, even the small ones. And if the child was old enough to understand, they would. Because everyone else was waiting too. It wasn't simply about food. It was about obedience, about patience, about humility before the divine order. In a society where seasons governed survival, and where hunger was a familiar visitor, discipline around meals took on spiritual weight. To wait for the bell was to acknowledge that one's needs did not come first. That the day and its blessings began not with appetite, but with permission. The sound of the bell itself varied. In small villages, it might be a single tone rung by hand, pulled by a sleepy sacristan still blinking in the morning gloom. In wealthier towns, it might be a small peal of 3 notes, each spaced just far enough apart to give the moment gravity. But no matter the shape or sound, the bell was heard. Its echoes softened across rooftops, over frost-bitten thatch, across the churchyard stones, and into the rooms of those who waited. Once it rang, life resumed. Bread was sliced, often thin, to make it last. Gruel was stirred slowly, sometimes sweetened with the last of the honey. Children were allowed to speak again. The day opened like a door, and each household stepped through it. The consequences of breaking the fast too early were not physical. No one would strike you, but there was a kind of social chill. A neighbor might notice. A passing glance might linger too long. A muttered phrase at the well. Some rise before the bell, but not always with blessings. Even the animals seemed to move more quietly in households where the rhythm had been broken. In some places, additional customs reinforced the practice. A piece of bread left overnight might be placed near the fire as an offering. Not eaten, not thrown. Just left, to acknowledge hunger and the choice to wait. A small gesture easily overlooked, but meaningful in its restraint. What's striking is that this wasn't a grand rule imposed by clergy. It was lived, daily, in the choices of ordinary people. It was kept alive not by sermons, but by memory. And though it may seem rigid by modern standards, there was comfort in its predictability. In knowing that every stomach, from the miller to the shepherd to the blacksmith's child, waited together. Even today, echoes of this remain. In the phrase, breaking the fast. In the way some older households still hold a moment of silence before a meal, even if only for a breath. The hunger may not be as sharp, the bells may not be heard, but the shape of the old rhythm lingers. So next time you eat in the early morning, imagine a world where one had to wait, not because there was no food, but because permission had not yet been given. A world where hunger met patience, and patience was its own kind of prayer. Speaking a dead person's name aloud kept their spirit trapped. Imagine a village shrouded in early morning mist. The church bell has not rung, yet the silence is heavier than usual. A door is ajar. A candle burns in the window. Someone has died, but no one says the name. You pass neighbors at the well. They nod solemnly, speak softly. His widow was seen before dawn, someone whispers. The youngest is still in her nightclothes. But even in private, the name is not spoken. Not yet. Not until the time is right. To name the dead too soon was to call them back, to interrupt a delicate, sacred passage between this world and whatever came after. It wasn't just superstition. It was responsibility. For families in the medieval world, and in many others before and after, the space between death and peace was not instantaneous. The soul, they believed, lingered, not by choice, always, but because of unfinished threads, grief, memory, confusion, longing. Saying their name too soon was like tugging on one of those threads, gently pulling them back toward the world they had just begun to leave. So households observed a code of silence. Not total silence, but linguistic caution. The departed might be referred to as he, or our elder, or simply Sometimes a gesture, a glance toward their chair, a folded cloth, carried the message. It was not fear but care. The same care with which a window might be left ajar for 3 days, to allow the soul to find its way. Or a mirror covered, so the spirit would not be trapped inside its own reflection. In these early days of mourning, everything slowed. The rhythm of life softened. The loom was quiet. The hearth was swept with gentler strokes. Even laughter was subdued, not as a form of forced sadness, but out of respect for the in-between. Life had paused, slightly, but deliberately. The idea that names had power was not unique to one region or time. In many cultures, naming was more than identification. It was invocation. To speak a name aloud was to acknowledge presence. In the world of the living, this was ordinary. But for the dead, especially the newly dead, it was a wait. A call they might answer. And answering meant turning back. In parts of rural Europe, particularly during the medieval period, this belief was embedded in practice. Mourning periods were formal, but also deeply personal. For some, it lasted 9 days. For others, a full year. During this time, names were spoken only in prayer or not at all. It wasn't just about the departed. It was about the living too. Children were taught to wait, to refer to their father or mother not by name but by title. Not to erase them, but to help them go forward. And if the name slipped out, sometimes a candle was lit. Sometimes a prayer was whispered. Sometimes a touch on the nearest wooden surface was enough. These were small gestures, not punishments, meant to soothe the disturbance, to gently apologize to the air. The sense was that the soul was listening, eager to move on, but vulnerable to being pulled off course. There are records, subtle, unassuming records, that show this practice enduring even into later centuries. A widow in Yorkshire in the 1600s reportedly refused to speak her husband's name for an entire planting season, though she spoke of him daily. In Eastern Europe, grave candles were lit each time the name of a recently deceased family member was mentioned, even by accident. In parts of North Africa and the Middle East, names were withheld until the 40-day threshold had passed, a period believed to mark the final departure of the soul. But what happens after the mourning ends? That's when the name returns, but gently, respectfully. It might be reintroduced in stories, in quiet laughter around the hearth. Do you remember when he? And then a pause, a smile, a nod, and at last, the name, softly spoken. No longer a trap, now a thread, one that connects memory to love, not sorrow. In this way, the act of not naming becomes as meaningful as the name itself. It marks a transition not only for the departed, but for those left behind. A moment in which time, speech, and silence all work together to acknowledge something that can't be seen, but is deeply felt. This tradition also speaks to a broader understanding of the relationship between language and reality. In modern times, we often treat names as neutral labels. But in earlier societies, names were not just words. They were bridges. To say a name was to reach out, sometimes backward, sometimes forward. In death, that reaching had to be handled with care. And so, for a time, the name waited. It waited while black cloth was hung over the doorway. It waited while food was delivered to the grieving. It waited as the favorite mug was left untouched on the shelf. It waited while the candles burned low. Until, eventually, the soul had gone where it needed to go. Only then did people begin to speak freely again. But the habit of care often lingered. Even years later, some might still refer to the dead by nickname or title, never quite returning to the full name. Not out of fear, but reverence. Some names, once carried across the veil, felt too heavy to bring all the way back. So imagine now a room gone quiet after burial. The air still carries the faint trace of incense, of candle wax, of soil. A chair remains pulled slightly from the table. And in this silence, no one says the name. Not yet. A sudden candle extinguishing meant death had entered. Imagine yourself in a small, stone-walled cottage near the edge of a medieval hamlet. The hour is late. The night is still. Outside, the air hangs thick with moisture, and the wind has settled into a breathless hush. Inside, only a single candle remains lit, its tiny flame dancing gently in the quiet. The room is wrapped in shadow. Wooden beams overhead creak softly with age, and the fire in the hearth has long since burned to embers. You sit in silence, perhaps finishing some sewing, or listening to the sound of your own breathing. And then, with no warning, the candle goes out. No breeze, no movement, no hand or draft. Just a flicker and darkness. In the rhythm of medieval life, such a moment was not explained away. It was felt. A candle that extinguished itself without cause was more than inconvenience. It was a sign, a silent declaration that something, someone, had entered unseen. Not a guest of flesh and blood, but of another kind entirely. Death had passed the threshold. Across much of medieval Europe, candles were not just sources of light. They were sentinels. Their flames were seen as guardians against darkness, both physical and spiritual. And when a candle went out unprovoked, especially at night, it was believed that its flame had been snuffed by an unseen force, something that didn't want to be seen, or something that could not be. The response was rarely loud. No shrieks, no running, just stillness. A housewife might silently reach for a splinter from the hearth. She'd relight the wick with hands that barely trembled and mutter a prayer under her breath, not for the flame itself, but for what it meant, for what might already be moving beyond the walls, for someone nearby who might not live through the week. This wasn't just fear. It was tradition, passed down through generations. The belief that light and life were connected, and that where one vanished, the other often followed. Candles were central to many rituals: births, funerals, marriages, vigil prayers. Their flames symbolized the soul, the breath, the divine spark. To watch one go out on its own was to witness an echo of a life fading. And so, when it happened without cause, people responded not with curiosity, but with caution. In some households, they would relight the candle using a taper, never directly from another flame. It was said that passing flame to flame too quickly after such an event might share the doom with another wick. In others, they whispered the names of family members aloud, trying to ward off the shadow by naming it. A child's name might be spoken twice, an elder's 3 times. In wealthier homes, the sudden extinguishing of a candle during supper or prayer might bring the entire room to pause. Servants exchanged glances. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. One might quietly excuse themselves to fetch holy water or sprinkle ash across the threshold. You see, in a time when sickness moved silently and news of a death could arrive by horse or by rumor, the boundaries between this world and the next felt much thinner. And the candle was one of the few tools people had to measure that border. It wasn't just homes that paid attention. Monasteries, too, recorded such moments. In several surviving texts from the 12th and 13th centuries, scribes noted instances where a candle went out during a night vigil, and within days, a monk took ill. One particularly well-preserved entry from a Cistercian abbey tells of a scriptorium where 3 candles flickered out in rapid succession, and 3 deaths followed within a week. The monks wrote of it not as superstition, but as fact. There were variations, of course. In some parts of Eastern Europe, the candle's behavior was read like an omen. A candle that flared high before dying meant a man would be taken. One that sputtered low and hissed before going out was said to signal a woman's passing. And if a candle flickered violently but did not die, it meant death had passed by, but not stopped. Naturally, not every candle held meaning. Drafts were real. Wicks burned low. Wax shifted. But in the quiet spaces of medieval life, where each hour moved slowly and each sound carried weight, even a small change could feel significant. And so, when a candle guttered and died without reason, it was not dismissed. It was marked. Sometimes, a candle went out during childbirth. The midwife would pause, then reach silently for another taper. Everyone in the room would glance at the mother, or the child, wondering which soul had been chosen. Other times, the candle went out during a vigil, just as someone was being prayed for, and the watchers would know, before any breath was checked, that the journey had ended. This belief persisted into later centuries. Even as science crept in, as homes filled with windows and books and learned men, there were still households that watched their candles. Still people who felt their stomachs tighten when a flame died suddenly. The old stories survived in corners, among the elderly, among the servants, among those who still kept fast during storms and laid rushes by the door at night. Even now, something of it remains. The flicker of a candle can still feel personal. The moment when it vanishes still draws the eye. And even if we laugh at superstition, few people find comfort in sudden darkness. In that sense, the medieval world lingers in shadow. So imagine once more, it's late. The fire is low. You sit near the door, needlework forgotten in your lap. A candle flickers beside you, steady and soft. Then, without wind or touch, the light disappears. You relight it, of course, but your thoughts wander. You whisper a name, or 2, and in the rhythm of your life, something shifts, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The darkness seems just a little heavier than it did before. Crossing paths with a monk before dawn was ominous. Imagine a winding dirt path between 2 villages just before sunrise. The sky is still dark, but the stars are beginning to fade. The fields on either side are quiet, covered in a thin silver frost. And then, Along the path, just ahead, a dark-robed figure comes into view. Hooded, walking slowly. Monk, you pause. Though your errand is urgent, your feet hesitate. You step to the side of the road. Not out of fear, exactly, but out of something quieter, something older. You murmur a blessing, and only once the monk has passed do you continue. In many parts of medieval and early modern Europe, monks were figures of deep respect. They lived lives of devotion and discipline. They tended to the poor, copied sacred texts, and prayed on behalf of the world. And yet, strangely, encountering a monk alone in the pre-dawn hours was seen not as a blessing, but as a bad sign, especially for travelers. It was believed that meeting a monk unexpectedly before first light could presage illness, spiritual conflict, or a disruption of fate. The monk was not unwelcome, but his presence, at that particular hour, disturbed the balance of the morning. The superstition may seem odd at first, but in a world where symbols and omens shaped understanding, it made a kind of sense. Dawn was not merely a time of day. It was a threshold, a passage from darkness to light, from dreams to action. And thresholds, in every old belief system, are powerful and fragile. To meet someone on that threshold meant something had been interrupted. Something unseen was being stirred. And if that someone wore the robes of a monastery, silent, solitary, possibly having walked for hours already, the effect was magnified. Monks walked often, especially those from wandering orders. They were permitted to leave their abbeys for reasons of charity, visitation, or pilgrimage. But they moved quietly, often alone, and they kept to the side roads, favoring silence over greeting. In those early hours, their presence could seem spectral. Travelers who met them would often step aside, lower their heads, and murmur a short prayer. Not for the monk, but for themselves. The idea was not that the monk was cursed. Rather, he was close to the divine, and by extension, close to the invisible forces that governed fate. To cross paths with him at that hour meant coming into contact with that invisible current. Some believed it meant your plans would not unfold as expected. Others thought it marked you for a test, a moral decision, a difficult choice, or a brush with loss. In parts of rural France, it was said that if you met a monk at dawn, you must return home and begin again, or at least, delay your journey until the sun had fully risen. The nature of the monk's appearance mattered too. If he was singing, it was considered less ominous. But if he walked in silence, head bowed, hands hidden in his sleeves, this was taken more seriously. Silence was, after all, the language of omens. There were even folk prayers crafted specifically for such encounters. Short, whispered verses meant to shield the soul from spiritual interference. They were passed down orally, never written. A string of words murmured into the collar of a cloak, just loud enough to be heard by the wind. The superstition carried special weight for those traveling alone. A merchant rising before dawn to reach market. A midwife called to a distant home. A shepherd returning from the hills. These were the ones most likely to meet a monk on the road, and most likely to carry the unease of that meeting through the rest of the day. In some regions, monks themselves were aware of this effect. A few were said to carry small bells, which they would ring softly as they walked, not to draw attention, but to alert others to their presence from a distance. Others deliberately delayed their morning walks until after sunrise to avoid discomfort, but not all orders observed such customs. Some embraced the liminal hours as sacred. The hour before dawn, known as matins, was a time for prayer, reflection, and movement through stillness. To these monks, the quiet road was not eerie, it was holy, a time when the world was listening more closely. The contrast between reverence and unease speaks to a broader theme in medieval life, the tension between the sacred and the unknown. People did not fear monks themselves, but they respected what monks might represent. Spiritual gravity, change, the invisible workings of fate. The fear was not of danger, but of interruption. The monk's sudden presence might shake loose the threads of a carefully prepared day. A cart might break. A message might be lost. A loved one might fall ill. And with no way to predict such things, the mind reached for symbols. Of course, not every early meeting foretold misfortune. Life carried on. But when things did go wrong, when a cough worsened, when a horse stumbled, when news arrived of a funeral, people remembered the monk in the road. The way his sandals brushed the dirt, the curve of his hood in the half-light. And they wondered. Even now, there's something oddly powerful about that image. A figure in robes walking alone at dawn, neither rushing nor pausing, moving between the sleeping world and the waking one. We no longer assign omens to such things, but the stillness remains. And so the path winds onward. The fields begin to glow. Birds begin to stir. The monk fades into the distance, and your steps resume. But some part of you glances back. Just once. A black cat watching you eat meant envy and ruin. Imagine yourself seated at a rough wooden table in a dim cottage, perhaps at dusk. The fire is low but steady, casting long shadows across the earthen floor. Before you rests a simple meal, bread, a bowl of stew, a wedge of cheese. Outside, the wind presses softly against the shutters. And from across the room, you feel it before you see it. A pair of eyes, golden and still, watching from beneath the stool. A black cat. Silent. Unmoving. Its gaze fixed not on you, but on your plate. To us, this might seem like a moment of quiet domesticity, a pet lingering in hopes of a scrap. But to someone living in another time, in a world ruled by invisible forces and household omens, the sight would have chilled the meal to stillness. A black cat watching you eat was not simply an animal at rest. It was a sign, a warning, and not one to be ignored. In rural Europe especially, though echoes of the belief appeared as far as the Middle East and parts of Africa, it was said that such a gaze invited envy into the home. Not the cat's envy, but something it represented. Hidden eyes. Spirits. Bad luck waiting to settle. The cat, with its dark coat and knowing stare, was thought to be a vessel of watching, of judgment, and of unseen hungers. Meals were intimate, sacred moments. In homes where food was scarce and every meal hard-won, eating was both necessity and ritual. It was one of the few times each day when families gathered, when silence meant gratitude, and when one's thoughts, however briefly, could rest. To have that space intruded upon by a black cat's gaze was to disturb a fragile peace. People took it seriously. Bread was covered. Salt was thrown. Crosses were made over plates or doorways. If the cat was known, perhaps a neighbor's or the household's own, it might be gently shooed away. If it was a stranger, an unfamiliar shadow near the threshold, it might be greeted with murmured prayers or even small offerings, milk set aside, or a crust left on the sill, to divert the gaze and keep misfortune occupied. The black cat, as a symbol, carries centuries of layered meaning. In ancient Egypt, cats were revered. In Norse legend, Freya's chariot was drawn by them. But in Christian Europe, especially after the 13th century, black cats became associated with night, with secrecy, and later, with witchcraft. By the early modern period, a black cat's behavior wasn't just an animal's instinct, it was a sign to be interpreted. If one crossed your path, misfortune. If one appeared on your doorstep and lingered, illness or betrayal. And if one stared as you ate, it was said that someone, somewhere, resented what you had. That envy had found its way in. Perhaps a neighbor. Perhaps a spirit. Perhaps something worse. Imagine, then, a woman ladling porridge into bowls for her children, only to glance up and see a black cat at the window, unmoving. Her hand might falter. Her eldest might whisper a warning. The meal, once ordinary, becomes uneasy. A few grains of salt might be tossed into the fire. A silent prayer might pass from one mouth to another. And the family would eat, but carefully. As if the food could turn, as if the warmth in their bellies might come at a price. Even in wealthier homes, the belief lingered. A lord might not speak of omens, but his cook might. A servant might glance nervously at the hearth if a black cat crossed the pantry. Belief did not require education. It required repetition. And these small superstitions endured because they offered a sense of control. Rituals that, if followed, might keep fortune from slipping. Sometimes, black cats were seen as familiars, magical companions to witches or practitioners of hidden arts. To be watched by one, especially during a vulnerable act like eating, meant you had been noticed. Not always personally, but symbolically. You were visible. And visibility, in a world of envy, scarcity, and whispered curses, was dangerous. And yet, these cats were not always feared. In some households, they were paradoxes, both ward and warning. A black cat might be kept not out of affection, but as a kind of sentinel. Better to have the gaze within your walls, where you could monitor it, than to risk meeting it at random in the wild. A black cat in the home might offer protection from others, but only if treated with deep respect. The belief had staying power. Even into the 19th century, there are records of people covering their plates when a cat entered the room. In some regions, it was advised to look away from the cat and not meet its eyes. To do so was to acknowledge the envy and to invite it closer. So meals were shielded. Candles burned a little longer. Children were taught to hush their laughter when a black shadow lingered near. The simple act of eating, so taken for granted today, was once a moment of deep vulnerability where unseen forces might peer through fur and silence. And when the cat finally moved, perhaps stretching, perhaps slipping away into the dusk, there would be a soft exhale, barely noticeable. The gaze was gone. The meal could continue, but a mark had been left. A memory, one that would join the long, slow rhythm of belief, passed down in glances, in half-told stories, and in rituals too quiet to question. Because sometimes, it wasn't what the cat was, it was what it saw, and what it might carry away with it into the night.